Montana Territory, 1875. The rolling prairies stretched out like an endless sea, the late summer sun turning the tall grasses into waves of gold. Thomas Finley stood at the edge of his property, the land he had claimed and fought for through 3 hard years. At 26, he already wore the weathered look of a man who had seen the worst the frontier could offer. Not in his face, which remained handsome with its square jaw and clear blue eyes, but in the way he carried himself, like a man perpetually bracing for the next storm. He ran a hand through his sandy brown hair, squinting toward the horizon where a plume of dust signaled approaching riders. Thomas had built his modest ranch through stubborn determination, backbreaking labor, and the firm belief that a man needed nothing but his own 2 hands and solitude to survive. The Civil War had taught him that lesson well enough. People are nothing but trouble, he muttered to his horse, a chestnut gelding that had been his only consistent companion. They either leave you or betray you. Better to keep to yourself. It was a mantra he'd repeated since arriving in Montana Territory. The false belief had served him well as armor, kept him focused when the winter winds howled through the cracks in his cabin walls and his stomach growled with hunger. A man alone could survive anything if he didn't have to worry about others. At least, that's what he told himself on those long, silent nights. His nearest neighbor, Jeremiah Wilson, had warned him just last month. A man wasn't meant to live alone out here, Thomas. This land breaks the solitary soul. Thomas had laughed it off. The land isn't what breaks men, other people do that just fine. Now he watched as the approaching party grew larger, revealing a wagon train of perhaps 6 families, making their slow way across the valley floor. Most would continue west, but some might settle, becoming new neighbors to contend with, new complications in his carefully constructed isolation. He sighed and mounted his horse. As the unofficial representative of this stretch of territory, being the first established rancher, he supposed he should at least find out their intentions, not out of neighborliness but pragmatism. Water rights and grazing boundaries were nothing to be casual about. The wagon train had stopped by the creek that marked the eastern edge of Thomas's claim when he approached. Children ran between the vehicles, their high voices carrying across the prairie as women tended fires and men unhitched tired oxen. Thomas felt a familiar discomfort settle over him at the sight of so many people. A tall man with a gray-streaked beard stepped forward. "Afternoon, sir. I'm Samuel Pierce, leading this company to the Bitterroot Valley." Thomas nodded stiffly. "Thomas Finley, this is my land you're stopping on." Pierce's face fell slightly. "Apologies, Mr. Finley. We needed water and rest. We can move along if—" "Creek's good for tonight," Thomas interrupted, unwilling to drive tired families onward just to preserve his solitude. "Just keep your stock from wandering." "Much obliged," Pierce gestured to the wagons. "We're mostly farmers looking for fresh starts, lost everything in the drought back east." Thomas was about to offer a cursory good luck when movement from the nearest wagon caught his eye. A young woman emerged, carrying a bucket toward the creek. Even from this distance, he could see she moved with a grace that seemed out of place on the harsh frontier. Her dress, though trail-worn, was a faded blue that matched the spring sky, and her hair, a rich golden blonde, was tied back in a simple braid that reached halfway down her back. "My niece," Pierce said, following Thomas's gaze. "Zara Whitaker, just turned 20 last month, lost her parents to influenza back in Ohio." Thomas quickly looked away, uncomfortable with being caught staring and even more uncomfortable with the unexpected flutter in his chest. "You should water downstream," he said abruptly to the girl as she approached. "Horses drink upstream." Instead of the meek acknowledgement he expected, the young woman stopped and assessed him with clear hazel eyes. "And how are we to know which is upstream when we've just arrived, Mr. Finley?" he supplied, somewhat taken aback by her direct manner. "Mr. Finley," she nodded, the sunlight catching the golden highlights in her hair. "I appreciate the guidance, though perhaps it might have been delivered with a touch more welcome." Before Thomas could respond, she continued past him, adjusting her course slightly toward the downstream portion of the creek. He found himself watching her go, noting the determined set of her shoulders beneath the worn calico, Samuel Pierce chuckled. She's got spirit, that one. Had to have it after all she's been through. Thomas tore his gaze away, irritated with himself. There's a trading post about 15 miles west. Man named Hollister runs it. Fair prices, no watering down the whiskey. He turned his horse, ready to retreat to his cabin. Good luck in the Bitterroot. Actually, Pierce said, stopping him, we've had some trouble. Lost 2 wagons crossing the Yellowstone last week. Wondering if you might know of any work hereabouts. Just until we can get back on our feet. Thomas stiffened. The last thing he wanted was entanglements with these people. Can't help you, he said curtly. My operation's small. Just me. Surely a ranch needs hands, a female voice interjected. Thomas turned to find Zara standing nearby, water bucket in hand. Up close, he could see the light dusting of freckles across the bridge of her nose, the determination in her jawline. I manage, he said flatly. From the look of your fences back yonder, she observed, you manage poorly. Pierce coughed uncomfortably. Zara, mind your. It's the truth, Uncle Samuel. Those north pasture fences would hardly keep in a sleeping cow. She turned those direct eyes back to Thomas. We're not asking for charity, Mr. Finley. We're offering fair work for fair pay. Thomas felt caught between annoyance and reluctant admiration for her boldness. He'd been meaning to repair those fences for weeks, but the work of one man only stretched so far. 3 days, he found himself saying. I can use help for 3 days, that's all. The smile that broke across her face was like sunrise over the mountains, sudden, brilliant, transformative. Excellent. My uncle and cousins are fine workers, and I'm handy with cooking and sewing if your cabin is in the same state as your fences. Before Thomas could protest that his domestic arrangements weren't her concern, Pierce was thanking him profusely, and several of the other men were approaching to introduce themselves. Thomas retreated as soon as possible, riding back to his cabin with a sense of having just made a terrible mistake. That evening, as he ate his usual solitary meal of beans and salt pork, Thomas tried to convince himself that 3 days of unwanted company was a small price to pay for getting his neglected fences repaired. He'd keep his distance, make it clear this was a business arrangement only, and soon enough they'd be on their way to the Bitterroot Valley. He refused to acknowledge the image of golden hair and challenging hazel eyes that kept appearing in his mind. The next morning, Samuel Pierce arrived with 4 other men and Zara in tow. The men immediately set to work on the fences under Thomas's brusque direction, while Zara, without invitation, strode directly to his cabin. Miss Whittaker, Thomas called after her, that's not necessary. She paused at his doorway, taking in the sparse interior with its single chair, rough-hewn table, and unmade bed. I believe it is entirely necessary, Mr. Finley, without waiting for permission, she entered, rolling up her sleeves. Thomas stood helplessly in his own doorway, watching as she assessed his living conditions with practical efficiency. I don't recall hiring a housekeeper, he finally said. Consider it included in the arrangement, she replied, already gathering dirty dishes. A man works better with a proper meal in his stomach and a clean place to rest his head. I've managed just fine. She gave him a skeptical look. If this is your definition of fine, Mr. Finley, I'd hate to see your definition of hardship. Despite himself, Thomas felt the corner of his mouth twitch. There was something refreshing about her directness, even as it unsettled his carefully constructed isolation. I should help your uncle with the fences, he said, retreating. An excellent idea, she agreed. I work better without supervision. Throughout that first day, Thomas kept his distance from the cabin, throwing himself into the fence work with single-minded focus. Pierce and his companions were indeed hard workers, making significant progress on the north pasture. They respected Thomas's reticence, speaking mainly of practical matters, the quality of the soil, the creek's water level, the prospects further west. It was nearing sundown when Thomas finally returned to his cabin, stopping short at the doorway. The transformation was remarkable. The dirt floor had been swept clean, his meager collection of cookware shone in the evening light, and the scent of actual cooking, not just warmed-over beans, filled the small space. Zara stood at his crude stove, stirring something in his largest pot. She had twisted her golden hair into a neat bun at the nape of her neck, and a few loose tendrils framed her face, which was flushed from the heat. "Hope you don't mind, but I used some of our supplies," she said without turning around. "Found your garden out back, it's in surprisingly good shape. Those potatoes and carrots needed using before they sprouted." Thomas stood awkwardly in his own doorway, suddenly aware of how long it had been since he'd shared a meal with anyone. "You didn't have to do all this." She glanced over her shoulder, those hazel eyes appraising him. "No, I didn't, but sometimes doing unnecessary things is what makes life worth the trouble of living it." That simple statement, delivered so matter-of-factly, struck Thomas with unexpected force. When had he last done anything unnecessary? His entire existence had narrowed to survival, to the basic requirements of keeping body and soul together on this unforgiving frontier. "The others will be hungry," he said, for lack of a better response. "Already taken care of, I brought them dinner at the work site." She ladled stew into a bowl and placed it on his now clean table. "Sit, Mr. Finley. Food tastes better when it's hot." As if in a dream, Thomas found himself obeying, sitting at his own table while this golden-haired stranger served him food in his own home. The stew was rich with vegetables and seasoned with herbs he didn't recognize. The first spoonful nearly made him groan aloud. "This is," he began, then stopped, not wanting to reveal how deeply the simple pleasure of good food affected him. "Yes, I know," she said with a small smile, sitting across from him with her own bowl. "Our wagon cook died crossing the Yellowstone. I've been handling meals since." She took a bite, considering. "Could use more time, but your garden hasn't got any." "I don't grow herbs," Thomas said. "Never saw the point." Zara looked at him as if he'd admitted to not believing in the sun. "The point, Mr. Finley, is that food should bring pleasure as well as sustenance. Otherwise, we're no better than your cattle, simply consuming to survive." There it was again, that suggestion that mere survival wasn't enough, that life should contain elements beyond the strictly necessary. It was a philosophy Thomas had abandoned years ago, yet hearing it from her lips made him aware of how much he'd surrendered. "The war taught me that survival is enough," he said quietly, surprised to find himself speaking of it at all. "Luxuries get forgotten quick when you're watching men die." Her expression softened. "You fought." Thomas nodded once, returning his attention to his bowl. "Union, joined in '63. Saw things no man should see." "My father and brother both served," she said. "Father came home, Garrett didn't." The simple statement contained volumes of grief, yet she delivered it with quiet dignity. Thomas looked up, seeing not pity in her eyes but understanding. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. "As am I for whatever you lost, Mr. Finley." She held his gaze a moment longer, then deliberately lightened her tone. "Now eat before it gets cold. I didn't spend hours cooking for you to let it go to waste." They finished the meal in surprisingly comfortable silence. When Thomas insisted on cleaning his own dishes, "You're not my servant, Miss Whittaker," she acquiesced with good grace and instead turned her attention to mending a shirt she'd found among his belongings. "That's really not necessary," he protested. "Again with the necessary," she said, threading a needle with practiced ease. "Consider it payment for the vegetables I used from your garden." As darkness fell, Samuel Pierce appeared at the cabin door to collect his niece. "We've set up camp by the creek, Zara. Best come along now." Thomas found himself oddly reluctant to see her go, a feeling that both confused and irritated him. "Your uncle and the others did good work today," he said stiffly. "The north pasture fences should be done by tomorrow noon." "Glad to hear it," Pierce said. "We're obliged for the opportunity, Mr. Finley." As Zara gathered her things to leave, she paused at the door. "I'll return in the morning to prepare breakfast, if that's acceptable." Before Thomas could object that he'd been preparing his own breakfasts for years, Pierce spoke up. "Actually, niece, I'd prefer you help Mrs. Cooper tomorrow. Her youngest has taken fever and she could use an extra hand." "Of course," Zara said immediately, though Thomas thought he detected a flicker of disappointment cross her features. Or perhaps he was projecting his own unexpected reaction. "I'm perfectly capable of cooking my own meals," Thomas said, perhaps more sharply than intended. Zara smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face from merely pretty to truly beautiful. "Of course you are, Mr. Finley, but capability and enjoyment are different matters entirely." With that, she departed with her uncle, leaving Thomas alone in his now clean cabin with the lingering scent of a meal prepared by hands other than his own. That night Thomas slept in sheets that had been washed and properly tucked, his head on a pillow that had been beaten free of dust. Despite his determination to maintain his emotional distance, he found his thoughts repeatedly returning to Zara Whittaker, not just her golden beauty, but the quiet strength she carried, the way she spoke of doing unnecessary things as if they were essential to truly living. It was a dangerous line of thinking, one that challenged the very foundations of the fortress he'd built around himself since the war. Thomas forced his mind back to practical matters. Tomorrow they would finish the north pasture fences, then move to the creekside section. 3 days and the Pierce party would be on their way. His life would return to its solitary rhythm. The thought brought no comfort. Morning arrived with the distant sound of voices from the camp by the creek. Thomas rose early as was his habit, preparing a simple breakfast of coffee and biscuits left from Zara's cooking the previous night. The biscuits, even cold, were better than anything he'd managed to produce in his years of bachelor cooking. He was saddling his horse when Samuel Pierce approached, accompanied by a different group of men than the previous day. "Rotating the work," Pierce explained. "Everyone wants a chance to earn a little before we move on." Thomas nodded, leading them to the day's task without unnecessary conversation. He worked alongside them, driving fence posts and stringing wire with practiced efficiency. Yet he found himself glancing occasionally toward the creek, wondering about the fever-stricken child and the golden-haired young woman tending to it. Around midday, as the men paused for a meal of jerky and hardtack, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. A rider appeared on the horizon, pushing his horse hard. "That's Daniel Cooper," one of Pierce's men said, shading his eyes. "Looks to be in a hurry." The rider, a young man barely out of his teens, reined in his horse sharply as he reached them. "Mr. Pierce, sir, Mrs. Cooper says to come quick. The fever's worse, and your niece thinks it might be scarlet fever." Pierce's face paled. "Sweet Jesus, has anyone else shown symptoms?" "Not yet, sir, but Miss Whittaker says we should isolate the Cooper's wagon, just to be safe." Thomas felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. Scarlet fever on the frontier was a death sentence for many, especially children. He'd seen entire settlements decimated by such outbreaks during his journey west. "We should move your camp," he found himself saying. "Further downstream, away from the main creek. There's a spring-fed pond on the southern edge of my property, better to separate the sick from the healthy." Pierce looked at him gratefully. "That's generous, Mr. Finley." "We'd be obliged." "It's practical," Thomas corrected, unwilling to acknowledge the concern he felt. "Disease spreads quick out here, no doctors for 50 miles. He hesitated only briefly before adding, "I've got some medical supplies at the cabin." "Not much, but quinine and willow bark at least." Without waiting for a response, Thomas mounted his horse and rode hard toward the encampment. The scene that greeted him was one of controlled chaos, wagons being hitched, children being gathered, worried faces everywhere. At the center of it all, directing movements with calm authority, stood Zara Whittaker. Her golden hair was partially escaped from its bun, and her blue dress was rumpled, but she moved with purpose, organizing families and issuing clear instructions. When she spotted Thomas, she quickly approached. "Mr. Finley, I'm afraid we've brought trouble to your doorstep." "Your uncle told me, scarlet fever." She nodded grimly. "Little Sarah Cooper, 5 years old. The rash appeared an hour ago. I've isolated their wagon and told everyone not to draw water from the creek, but—" "There's a pond south of here," Thomas interrupted. "Clean water fed by an underground spring. I told your uncle to move the camp there." Relief washed over her face. "Thank you, that's extremely kind." "It's practical," he repeated, uncomfortable with her gratitude. I've got medical supplies at the cabin. Not much, but anything would help, she said earnestly. We lost most of our medicines crossing the river. Thomas hesitated, then made a decision. The Cooper should stay in my cabin. Zara's eyes widened. Mr. Finley, we couldn't possibly. It's isolated from the others, he insisted. And it's clean now, thanks to you. I can sleep in the barn until things resolve one way or another. The unspoken possibility that the child might die hung between them. Zara's expression softened, and she placed a hand briefly on his arm. You're a better man than you pretend to be, Thomas Finley. The touch of her hand, the use of his first name, the quiet certainty in her voice, all combined to create a warmth in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. Thomas stepped back, flustered and determined not to show it. I'll fetch those supplies and clear my things from the cabin, he said brusquely. The pond is about a mile south. Follow the creek, then head east at the large cottonwood with the split trunk. With that, he rode off toward his cabin, his mind racing. What was he doing, inviting 6 strangers into his home? It was precisely the kind of entanglement he'd sworn to avoid. Yet the image of Zara Whittaker's face when he'd offered, the genuine gratitude and surprise, made something long dormant stir within him. By nightfall, the camp had been relocated to the pond, and the Cooper family, mother, father, and 3 children including the sick little girl, had been settled into Thomas's cabin. Zara had taken charge of nursing the child, her calm competence a reassurance to the distraught parents. Thomas established himself in the barn, arranging a makeshift bed in the hayloft. It wasn't so different from conditions he'd endured during the war, though the sweet scent of hay was certainly preferable to the smells of a battlefield camp. He was checking on his horses when Zara appeared in the barn doorway, looking exhausted but determined. Sarah's fever is still high, she reported, but the quinine seems to be helping a little. Thank you for the supplies. Thomas nodded awkwardly. How are the others? Any signs of sickness? Not yet. We've told everyone to watch for symptoms. She leaned against the doorframe, the weight of responsibility evident in the slump of her shoulders. It's going to be a long night. You should rest, Thomas said. You can't help the child if you collapse from exhaustion. A small smile touched her lips. Is that concern I hear, Mr. Finley? Practicality, he insisted, though the excuse was wearing thin even to his own ears. Do you need anything else from the barn? I've got extra blankets stored in that trunk. Actually, I came to ask if you'd mind checking on Sarah for a few hours while I help with the new campsite. Mrs. Cooper is beside herself with worry, not thinking clearly, and Mr. Cooper is trying to manage the other children. The request caught Thomas off guard. I'm not much for nursing, he said uncomfortably. Wouldn't someone else be better suited? Zara straightened, fixing him with those direct hazel eyes. Everyone else is settling the new camp or watching for symptoms in their own children. And contrary to what you might think, I believe you're exactly the right person. Why is that? Because beneath all that gruffness and isolation, I see a man who cares enough to give up his home to strangers, she said simply. And right now, that little girl needs someone strong and steady beside her. Put that way, Thomas found he couldn't refuse. He followed Zara back to the cabin, where she briefly introduced him to the Coopers and showed him how to apply the cool compresses to Sarah's feverish forehead. Just keep her comfortable, Zara instructed. Make sure she drinks water when she wakes. I won't be long, just need to help organize the new camp and check on the others. With that, she was gone, leaving Thomas alone with the sick child and her anxious parents. Mrs. Cooper sat in exhausted silence while her husband took their other children outside to give the small cabin some breathing room. Thomas sat awkwardly beside the bed, his bed, where little Sarah lay burning with fever, her face flushed and her breathing shallow. Her blonde curls, damp with sweat, reminded him painfully of his younger sister, lost to a similar fever when he was just 12 years old. You're going to be all right, little one, he found himself murmuring, gently placing a fresh compress on her forehead. You're stronger than this fever. As the hours passed, Thomas settled into the rhythm of care, changing compresses, offering water, murmuring reassurances. Mrs. Cooper eventually succumbed to exhaustion, falling asleep in the cabin's only chair. The silence was broken only by the child's labored breathing and the occasional creak of the cabin's timbers. It was near midnight when Sarah's eyes fluttered open, focusing on Thomas with feverish intensity. "Are you an angel?" she whispered, her voice raspy. Thomas nearly laughed at the absurdity. Him, an angel with all the blood on his hands from the war. "No, little one. Just a neighbor helping out." "Mama says angels watch over sick people," she persisted with the logic of a fevered child. "Then your mama's probably right," Thomas said gently. "But I'm just here to keep you company until they arrive. Would you like some water?" The child nodded weakly, and Thomas helped her take a few sips before she drifted back to sleep. Something shifted in his chest as he watched her, a protective instinct he'd thought long buried beneath layers of hard-won isolation. When Zara returned an hour later, she found Thomas still at his post, vigilant and attentive. She paused in the doorway, observing the unexpected tenderness with which this supposedly hardened loner cared for the sick child. "How is she?" Zara asked softly, crossing to feel Sarah's forehead. "Fever's still high, but she woke briefly." "Took some water." Zara nodded. "That's a good sign." She studied his face, noting the weariness there. "You should get some rest now. I'll take over." Thomas stood, suddenly aware of the intimacy of the small cabin, of Zara's proximity in the dim lamplight. "Anyone else showing symptoms?" "Not yet. We're praying it's contained to just Sarah." "Prayer's not much protection against fever," Thomas said, more harshly than he intended. Rather than take offense, Zara simply regarded him steadily. "Perhaps not, but it reminds us we're not alone in our struggles. Sometimes that's enough to keep fighting." The simple wisdom of her words struck Thomas silent. He'd been so determined to face life alone, to need no one, that he'd forgotten the strength that could come from shared burden. "I'll be in the barn if you need anything," he finally said, retreating from emotions he wasn't ready to confront. Outside, the night air was cool and clarifying. Thomas paused on his porch, looking up at the vast canopy of stars that had been his only companions for so long. For the first time in years, his solitude felt less like freedom and more like emptiness. The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity. The fence work continued, though at a slower pace as everyone's attention was divided by concern for little Sarah Cooper. The fever raged, broke, then returned with frightening intensity. Throughout it all, Zara remained a constant presence, tending the child with unwavering dedication. Thomas found himself drawn into the orbit of the encampment despite his inclinations toward solitude. He helped move supplies, checked on the isolated cabin frequently, and even joined the men for an evening meal around the campfire. The sense of community, something he'd actively avoided since the war, felt strangely comforting. On the 4th day, as Thomas was repairing a broken wagon wheel for one of the families, Samuel Pierce approached with a grave expression. "Finley, we need to talk," he said without preamble. "Sarah's fever broke this morning. Zara thinks she's past the worst of it." Relief washed through Thomas. "That's good news." "It is," Pierce agreed. "But we've overstayed our welcome by a day already. The others are getting restless, worried about making it to the Bitterroot before the first snow." Thomas nodded, understanding the realities of frontier travel. "The Cooper girl isn't ready to travel yet." "No, she isn't, which puts us in a difficult position." Pierce removed his hat, turning it in his hands, a gesture of discomfort. "The Coopers have decided to stay behind until Sarah recovers, then catch up. But they shouldn't be alone, and my niece, well, Zara refuses to leave them." A complex wave of emotions swept through Thomas: concern, relief that the child was improving, and an unexpected surge of gladness that Zara would be staying longer. He quickly suppressed the latter. "They're welcome to remain until the girl can travel," he said carefully. "I can continue sleeping in the barn." Pierce studied him thoughtfully. "You're not what I expected when we first met, Finley. I took you for a hard man with little charity in him." Thomas shrugged uncomfortably. "Don't mistake practicality for charity. Disease spreads. Better to let the girl recover fully than risk an outbreak in your whole party. Practicality, Pierce repeated with a knowing smile. Is that what you call it? Well, whatever your reasons, we're grateful. He replaced his hat. We'll move out tomorrow morning, leave you some supplies for your trouble. That's not necessary. Maybe not, Pierce said, echoing his niece's philosophy, but sometimes it's the unnecessary things that matter most. That evening, as the wagon train prepared for departure, Thomas found himself standing awkwardly outside his own cabin, hesitant to intrude. The door opened before he could decide, and Zara stepped out, looking tired but relieved. "Mr. Finley," she greeted him, "I was just coming to find you. Sarah asked to thank the angel who helped her." Thomas felt heat rise to his face. "No need for thanks. The child's recovering, that's what matters." Zara studied him with those perceptive hazel eyes. "My uncle tells me you've agreed to let us stay until Sarah can travel." "It seems the sensible course." "Sensible," she repeated with a small smile. "You have many words for kindness, Mr. Finley, but you seem reluctant to call it by its true name." Before Thomas could formulate a response, Mrs. Cooper appeared in the doorway, her face drawn with exhaustion but brightened by hope. "Mr. Finley, I don't know how to thank you for all you've done," she said earnestly. "Opening your home to us, providing medicines Sarah would have," she trailed off, unable to speak the fear that had haunted them all. "Anyone would have done the same," Thomas said uncomfortably. "No," Mrs. Cooper said firmly, "anyone would not have. We've encountered plenty on this journey who wouldn't spare a drop of water, let alone their home." She reached out and clasped his hand briefly. "You're a good man, whatever you might think of yourself." With that, she returned inside, leaving Thomas even more discomfited by the genuine gratitude. He turned to find Zara watching him with a gentle expression. "You really don't know how to accept thanks, do you?" she observed. "Not much practice," he admitted. "Been alone a long time." "Why is that, I wonder?" Zara leaned against the porch post, regarding him thoughtfully. "A young man with land, capabilities, obvious intelligence. Most would be starting families, building communities." Thomas looked away, across the darkening prairie toward the distant mountains. "The war taught me that connections are dangerous. People leave or die or betray you. Easier to rely on yourself." "Easier perhaps," Zara acknowledged, "but is it better?" The question hung in the air between them, challenging the very foundation of the life Thomas had built for himself. Before he could respond, little Sarah's voice called from inside, and Zara straightened. "Duty calls," she said with a small smile. "We've moved our things to the corner, but if you'd like to reclaim your cabin—" "No," Thomas interrupted. "The barn is fine, better for everyone this way." Zara nodded, though something like disappointment flickered across her features. "As you wish, Mr. Finley. Good night, then." As she disappeared back into the cabin, Thomas remained on the porch, staring out at the land that had been his sole companion for 3 years. For the first time, he wondered if the isolation he'd cultivated was truly the protection he'd believed it to be, or if it was simply another kind of prison. The wagon train departed the next morning in a flurry of activity, promises to wait in the Bitterroot if possible, and tearful goodbyes. Thomas watched from a distance, unwilling to intrude on the farewells between Zara and her family. Samuel Pierce sought him out before mounting up. "I'm entrusting my niece to your protection, Finley," he said solemnly. "She's all the family I have left." "She'll come to no harm here," Thomas assured him, understanding the weight of such responsibility. "It's not physical harm I'm concerned about," Pierce said with surprising perception. "Zara has known enough loss in her young life. I'd not see her heart injured further." Before Thomas could decipher this cryptic warning, Pierce had mounted his horse and was calling final instructions to his niece. Minutes later, the wagon train was moving slowly westward, leaving behind only the Cooper family, Zara, and a strange new tension in the air. The following days established an unexpected domestic routine. Thomas resumed sleeping in the barn, taking his meals with the Coopers, and Zara either outside on fair days or in the cabin when weather threatened. Sarah continued to improve, though slowly, her strength returning in small increments. Zara proved herself invaluable, not only in nursing Sarah, but in maintaining the household. She established a kitchen garden using seeds she'd brought from Ohio, tended the existing vegetable patch with expert care, and transformed Thomas's crude bachelor quarters into something resembling a home. Despite his determination to maintain emotional distance, Thomas found himself drawn into their makeshift family circle. He told stories to Sarah during her convalescence, helped Mr. Cooper repair their wagon, and spent evenings engaged in actual conversation, something he'd nearly forgotten the pleasure of. Most dangerously, he found himself seeking out Zara's company, first under the guise of practical matters, then simply for the enjoyment of her perspective. She approached frontier life with a balance of pragmatism and hope that challenged his cynicism at every turn. "You can't truly believe the world is so dark," she said one evening as they sat on the porch while the Coopers slept inside. The setting sun painted the prairie in gold and amber, a beauty that even Thomas couldn't deny. "I've seen the darkness," he replied quietly, "not just in the war, out here too. Men will kill for water rights or grazing land. Winter doesn't care how good your intentions are when the food runs out." "All true," Zara acknowledged, "yet look at this." She gestured toward the sunset, the rolling land, the distant mountains. "There's darkness, yes, but there's also this. And good people like the Coopers, and kindness from strangers like you." "I'm not kind," Thomas insisted, uncomfortable with her assessment, "just practical." Zara laughed, the sound like clear water over stones. "Your practicality gave a sick child a bed and medicines. Your practicality feeds a family not your own. If that's merely being practical, Mr. Finley, then you have a very unusual definition of the word." She turned those perceptive hazel eyes on him, suddenly serious. "Why is it so difficult for you to acknowledge goodness in yourself?" The question struck too close to truths Thomas had buried deep. He stood abruptly. "Getting late, I should check on the horses." As he retreated to the barn, Thomas could feel Zara's gaze following him, not judging but seeing too much. That was the problem with letting people close. They began to see past the carefully constructed walls to the vulnerabilities beneath. Yet even as he told himself to reinforce those walls, Thomas knew something fundamental had shifted. The solitude that had once felt like security now seemed hollow. The cabin, temporarily transformed by the presence of others, would feel emptier than ever when they departed. And they would depart. The thought struck him with unexpected force as he settled into his makeshift bed in the hayloft. Sarah grew stronger each day. Soon the Coopers would continue their journey west, taking Zara with them. His land would be his alone again, just as he'd always wanted. The realization brought no comfort, only a hollow ache in his chest that he refused to name. The next day dawned with ominous clouds gathering on the western horizon. Thomas rose early, checking the sky with a practiced eye. A storm was brewing, likely a significant one given the season. He made his way to the cabin to warn the others. Zara was already awake, preparing breakfast as Sarah played quietly on the floor with a doll Thomas had roughly carved for her during her illness. The domestic scene struck him with unexpected force. The warmth, the simple human connection, everything he'd convinced himself he neither wanted nor needed. "Storm coming," he announced, forcing his attention to practical matters. "A big one by the look of it. Best secure anything that might blow away." Zara nodded, immediately shifting to emergency preparations with the adaptability that continued to impress him. "I'll help Mr. Cooper tie down their wagon." "Sarah, stay inside today, all right? We don't want you catching cold after all your progress." The little girl nodded solemnly, clutching her doll. "Will the angel stay with me?" Thomas still found himself uncomfortable with the child's perception of him, but couldn't bring himself to correct her. "I need to check the livestock first, make sure they're sheltered, but I'll come back." True to his word, after securing his small herd and helping Cooper anchor their wagon, Thomas returned to the cabin. The sky had darkened significantly, and the wind was rising, carrying the scent of imminent rain. Inside, he found Sarah alone, Mrs. Cooper having gone to gather laundry from the line before the storm hit. The child looked up with simple trust as he entered. I'm scared of storms, she confessed. The thunder sounds like guns. Thomas sat beside her on the floor, his large frame awkward in the small space. It does, doesn't it? But it's just the sky having a conversation with the earth. Nothing to fear. That's what Miss Zara says too, Sarah said, her eyes wide. But I still get scared. In Ohio, a storm blew our neighbor's roof clean off. Well, this roof is sturdy, Thomas assured her. I built it myself, extra strong because Montana storms can get mighty fierce. Did you build everything yourself, with no help? The simple question carried implications Thomas wasn't prepared to examine. Yes. Just me. Sarah considered this, her small face serious. That's sad. Papa says work goes better with help, and it's lonesome to work alone. Out of the mouths of children, Thomas thought wryly. Sometimes alone is safer, he said, then wondered why he was trying to justify his choices to a 5-year-old. Safer from what? Sarah pressed, with a child's relentless curiosity. Thomas hesitated. How could he explain to a child the complexities of loss, betrayal, and the protective shell he'd built around himself? Before he could formulate a response, the door burst open, admitting Zara and Mrs. Cooper along with a gust of wind. Storm's almost on us, Zara announced, her cheeks flushed from exertion. Mr. Cooper is securing the last of the wagon covers. He'll be right behind us. As if in confirmation, thunder rolled across the prairie, and Sarah instinctively moved closer to Thomas. He found himself placing a reassuring hand on her small shoulder. Just the sky talking, he reminded her softly. The storm broke with sudden fury, rain lashing the cabin in horizontal sheets, wind howling around the corners, thunder cracking overhead. Mr. Cooper arrived moments before the worst hit, soaked to the skin but relieved to be inside. For the next several hours they were confined to the small cabin, listening to nature's fury. Thomas found himself telling stories to distract Sarah from the thunder, tales of his journey west, carefully edited to remove the darker elements, and descriptions of the beauty he'd found in the Montana territory. You love this land, Zara observed during a brief lull in the storm. Thomas nodded, surprised by her perception. It's honest land, harsh sometimes, but it doesn't lie to you. What you see is what you get. Unlike people, she suggested, too perceptive by half. Thomas gave her a sharp look but didn't deny it. The storm continued into the evening, eventually settling into a steady downpour. As night fell, Thomas prepared to make a dash to the barn, but Zara stopped him at the door. You can't possibly sleep out there tonight, she said firmly. The roof leaks in 3 places. I noticed it when we first arrived. I've slept in worse, Thomas insisted. That doesn't mean you should. Zara crossed her arms, immovable. There's plenty of room in here. Mr. and Mrs. Cooper and Sarah have the bed. You can take the floor by the fire and I'll use the chair. Thomas opened his mouth to protest further, but Mrs. Cooper intervened. Miss Whittaker is right, Mr. Finley. It's your home, after all. We'd not see you soaked through for our comfort. Outnumbered and, if he was honest with himself, not eager to face the deluge, Thomas reluctantly agreed. The Coopers settled Sarah between them on the bed, while Zara arranged blankets near the fireplace. You take the chair, Thomas insisted. I'm used to hard ground. Always the gentleman despite your protests, Zara said with a smile. Very well, but at least take the extra quilts. As the storm raged outside, the cabin felt impossibly small, intimate in a way Thomas hadn't experienced in years. The firelight cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the steady drumming of rain on the roof created a cocooning effect, as if they were the only people for 100 miles. In truth, they nearly were. Thomas lay awake long after the others had fallen asleep, acutely aware of Zara's presence a few feet away. Her breathing had evened into the rhythm of sleep, her face peaceful in the dying firelight. Golden hair spilled over the arm of the chair, catching amber highlights from the embers. In that moment, the carefully constructed walls around his heart developed a dangerous crack. The realization that he would miss her, when she left was no longer possible to deny. Worse, he would miss not just Zara but all of it, the shared meals, the conversations, the sense of purpose beyond mere survival. He had built his life around the belief that isolation was safety. Now, watching this makeshift family sleep under his roof, he was forced to confront a more frightening truth. Isolation might protect from pain, but it also barred the way to joy. Thomas turned away from the unsettling realization, focusing instead on the storm outside. But even the familiar sound of rain on his roof seemed different now, less lonely, more like nature's lullaby for the small community sheltered within. The storm continued through the night and into the next day, saturating the prairie and turning the dirt roads to mud. Travel would be impossible for at least several days, a fact that brought Thomas a secret relief he wasn't ready to acknowledge. By the second day, cabin fever began to set in, particularly for Sarah, who had been confined indoors for too long. Despite the continuing rain, Thomas rigged a canvas awning off the porch, creating a small dry area where the child could at least get fresh air. "You're good with her," Zara observed as they watched Sarah splash in puddles under her mother's watchful eye. Thomas shrugged uncomfortably. "Had a sister once. Caroline, she was about Sarah's age when—" He stopped, the old grief still raw despite the years. Zara didn't press, simply waited with quiet empathy. "Fever took her," Thomas finally continued, "like what nearly took Sarah. After that, our family was never the same. Father drank, mother withdrew into herself. When the war came, it seemed as good a reason as any to leave." "And after the war? No thoughts of returning home?" Thomas shook his head. "Nothing to return to. Father died while I was fighting. Mother followed a year later. The farm was sold for taxes." "I'm sorry," Zara said softly, and he could see she truly meant it. "Loss seems to follow us both." Thomas looked at her then, really looked at her, seeing the shadows of grief behind her clear gaze. "Your parents and your brother." She nodded, all within 2 years. The influenza took mother and father. "Garrett never came home from Gettysburg." She managed a small smile. "Uncle Samuel has been my salvation, taking me in, bringing me west for a fresh start." "Is that what you want? A fresh start?" The question hung between them, weighted with unspoken implications. Zara considered it carefully before answering. "I want a life with purpose," she said finally, "not just survival but living. Building something that matters, whether it's a home or a family or simply days filled with meaning." She looked directly at him. "What do you want, Thomas?" It was the first time she had used his given name, and the intimacy of it caught him off guard. More disarming still was the question itself, so simple yet so profound. What did he want? For years the answer had been straightforward: land, self-sufficiency, isolation. Now those certainties seemed less solid. "I don't know anymore," he admitted, the honesty surprising even himself. Zara's expression softened. "That's a more truthful answer than most people ever give." The rain chose that moment to intensify, driving Sarah and Mrs. Cooper back under the shelter of the porch. The conversation shifted to practical matters, but Thomas found his thoughts returning to Zara's question throughout the day. What did he want? The storm finally broke on the third day, leaving behind a transformed landscape: muddy roads, swollen creeks, and fields of wildflowers already pushing up through the saturated earth. The sun emerged with renewed brilliance, drying the land with remarkable speed. By the fourth day after the storm, the Coopers began making preparations to continue their journey. Sarah had regained her strength, the roads were becoming passable, and the window for safe travel before winter was narrowing. "We'll leave tomorrow if the weather holds," Mr. Cooper announced at breakfast. "We've imposed on Mr. Finley's hospitality long enough." "No imposition," Thomas found himself saying, surprising everyone including himself. "You're welcome to stay longer if needed." Mrs. Cooper smiled gently. "That's kind, but we should try to catch up with the others. We've lost enough time." As the day progressed, Thomas found himself increasingly agitated. The prospect of returning to his solitary existence, once comforting, now felt like an approaching sentence. Worse, he couldn't stop wondering what Zara's plans were, but pride prevented him from asking directly. His opportunity came late that afternoon as he helped Mr. Cooper make final repairs to their wagon. Zara was inside with Mrs. Cooper packing their meager belongings. Your niece, Thomas began awkwardly, she travels with you to the Bitterroot. Cooper paused in his work, giving Thomas a considering look. That was the plan, yes, unless something's changed to alter her course. The implication was clear, but Thomas couldn't bring himself to respond to it directly. Instead, he focused on tightening a loose wheel bolt with more force than necessary. She's a remarkable young woman, Cooper continued when Thomas remained silent. Strong, capable. Deserves a good life after all she's lost. She does, Thomas agreed quietly. A woman like that needs more than just survival, Cooper pressed. Needs purpose, community. A partner who sees her worth. Thomas straightened, meeting the older man's gaze directly. Why are you telling me this? Cooper shrugged, just observations from a grateful man. You saved my daughter's life, Mr. Finley. Least I can do is speak plain about what I see. He returned to his work, adding almost casually, never known a woman to put such care into a home not her own, unless she had reason to hope it might someday be. The words landed like a physical blow, forcing Thomas to confront possibilities he'd been avoiding. Could Zara possibly see something in him worth staying for? And more importantly, was he capable of offering her the life she deserved, not mere survival, but the purpose and meaning she spoke of? The questions followed him through the evening as they shared a final meal together. Thomas found himself watching Zara, the grace with which she moved, the kindness she showed to Sarah, the quiet strength that had endured so much loss yet remained unbroken. Later, as twilight settled over the land, Thomas found Zara alone on the porch, gazing westward where the first stars were appearing. Beautiful evening, he said, coming to stand beside her. It is, she agreed. Your land has a way of showing off its best features, just when I'm preparing to leave it. The opening was clear, but Thomas hesitated, uncertainty holding him back. You're set on the Bitterroot, then? Zara turned to face him, her expression unreadable in the gathering dusk. I've made no permanent decisions. The Coopers have been kind enough to include me in their plans, but, Thomas prompted when she didn't continue. Zara sighed, her gaze returning to the horizon. But I find myself reluctant to leave this place, which is foolish, I suppose. I've no claim here, no purpose beyond the temporary one that's now complete. You could have a purpose, Thomas said, the words emerging before courage could fail him. A claim. Now Zara's full attention was on him, those hazel eyes searching his face for meaning. What are you saying, Thomas? He took a deep breath, forcing himself to continue. I'm saying that this land, this home, has never felt right until now, until you. The truth of it struck him fully as he spoke. His carefully constructed isolation had never been the sanctuary he'd pretended, only a fortress against the very connections that made life worth living. The war taught me to see only danger in caring for others, he continued, taking a step toward her. I convinced myself that survival alone was enough, that independence meant never needing anyone. He shook his head, amazed at his own blindness. But these past weeks have shown me what I've been missing, what true living looks like. Zara's expression softened, hope dawning in her eyes. And what does true living look like, Thomas Finley? It looks like meals shared instead of eaten alone, he said, taking another step closer. Stories told by firelight, gardens planted for beauty as well as necessity. It looks like, he hesitated, then finished simply, it looks like you, Zara. She drew in a sharp breath, her hand coming up to rest against the porch post for support. Those are beautiful words from a man who claims not to need connection. I was wrong, Thomas admitted, about many things, but I know now what I want. He closed the remaining distance between them, carefully taking her hands in his. I want you to stay, not as a guest, not temporarily. As what then? Zara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas looked out at the land stretching before them, his land, the property he had worked and fought for. Then back to Zara, whose presence had transformed it from mere acreage to a home. You can have my land, he said quietly, the words coming straight from his heart, but I'd rather give you my name. Zara's eyes widened, a mix of shock and joy washing across her features. Thomas, are you asking? I'm asking you to marry me, he confirmed, surprised by the steadiness in his voice despite the hammering of his heart. "To build a life here together. It won't always be easy, but I promise you'll never face the hard times alone. And the good times, I want to share those with you too." Tears welled in Zara's eyes, catching the last light of day. "You hardly know me," she said, though her hands tightened around his. "I know enough," Thomas countered. "I know you're strong and kind and brave. I know you see beauty where others see only hardship. I know you've faced loss and still choose hope." He lifted one hand to gently brush a tear from her cheek. "The rest, we can learn together if you want to." For a heart-stopping moment, Zara was silent, searching his face. Then slowly, beautifully, she smiled. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I want to." The single word transformed Thomas's world. The walls he had built so carefully around his heart crumbled completely, replaced by something infinitely stronger, not isolation but connection. Not mere survival but love. He drew her gently into his arms, marveling at how perfectly she fit against him, as if they had been crafted for this very purpose. When their lips met, it was like coming home to a place he hadn't known existed, tender and passionate and full of promise. Above them, stars emerged in the vast Montana sky, witnesses to a frontier miracle. Two souls who had known profound loss, finding in each other not just companionship but redemption. The land stretched out around them, no longer just Thomas's, but theirs to share, to work, to transform into something meaningful. Inside the cabin, the Coopers prepared for their journey, unaware that plans had changed. Tomorrow would bring announcements and adjustments, perhaps a hasty wedding before they departed to carry the news to Zara's uncle in the Bitterroot. But tonight belonged to Thomas and Zara alone, to whispered promises, to shared dreams, to the miraculous discovery that even on the harsh frontier, love could take root and flourish. As darkness fell completely, they remained on the porch, planning their future under the canopy of stars. Thomas felt a peace he hadn't known since before the war, perhaps had never truly known at all. The false belief that had guided him for so long, that isolation was safety, that connections brought only pain, had been replaced by a deeper truth, that in the right arms, vulnerability became strength. "What are you thinking?" Zara asked, her head resting against his shoulder as they gazed out at the land that would be their home. Thomas smiled, drawing her closer. "I'm thinking that for a man who prided himself on practicality, I've made the most impractical decision of my life. And I couldn't be happier about it." Zara laughed, the sound melding with the night music of crickets and distant coyotes. "Perhaps it's the most practical decision of all. Two people facing the frontier together stand a better chance than one alone." "Is that why you said yes, practicality?" Thomas teased, knowing the answer. Zara lifted her face to his, her expression serious despite her smile. "I said yes because in your eyes I see a future worth building. In your hands I feel safe even knowing the dangers we'll face. And in your heart, which you tried so hard to keep walled away, I recognize a kindred spirit who knows loss but chooses love anyway." The simple eloquence of her words moved Thomas deeply. He had no response but to kiss her again, pouring into the gesture all the emotion he was still learning to express. Later, they would face the practicalities of their decision, the wedding arrangements, the adjustments to the cabin, the long-term plans for the ranch. But in that moment beneath the vast Montana sky, they simply held each other, two souls who had journeyed through darkness to find unexpected light. The land stretched before them, no longer a solitary kingdom but a shared domain, ready to be transformed by their combined vision. And as Thomas held Zara in his arms, he silently thanked whatever fate or providence had brought her to his doorstep. The woman who had taught him that true strength lay not in isolation, but in the courage to love despite all risk. "Our land," he whispered against her hair, "our home." Zara's arms tightened around him. "Our future," she added, completing the promise. And so began their story together, not an ending but a beginning. A testament to the enduring truth that even in the wild, unforgiving landscape of the American West, love could take root, flourish, and transform a solitary existence into a life truly worth living. 5 years later, Thomas stood on the same porch, watching as Zara moved through their garden, their 3-year-old daughter Caroline following in her wake, a tiny watering can clutched in determined hands. Their infant son James slept in a cradle nearby, his presence a daily miracle that Thomas still marveled at. The ranch had prospered beyond his solitary imaginings, expanded now to include better grazing lands, improved cattle stock, and a larger cabin that Zara insisted on calling our home rather than the house. The isolation that had once defined his existence was replaced by community, neighbors who gathered for barn raisings and harvests, friends who shared meals and music on long winter evenings. Zara looked up, catching his gaze, and smiled, the same smile that had first broken through his carefully constructed walls. In that smile, Thomas saw their shared journey, the hardships weathered together, the joys multiplied by sharing, the love that had transformed a lonely piece of land into the center of a meaningful life. "Papa," Caroline called, spotting him, "come see what we planted." As Thomas moved to join his family in the garden, he reflected on the words that had changed his life forever. "You can have my land, but I'd rather give you my name." In the end, he had given Zara both, the land and his name. But she had given him something infinitely more valuable, a heart reopened to love and the courage to build not just a homestead, but a home. The Montana territory was still harsh, still demanding, still dangerous at times. But faced together with love as their foundation, it was no longer a wilderness to be endured, but a promised land to be cherished. And that, Thomas thought as he scooped his daughter into his arms and kissed his wife beneath the vast Montana sky, was the most practical miracle of all.